I'm not the most technical person in the room. I don't write production code. I don't tune infrastructure. But I spend time inside large Microsoft environments, the kind where thousands of people collaborate daily, where financial transactions flow through teams, where compliance auditors show up asking questions about who can access what. And here's what I've learned. The biggest problems I see are never technical problems. They're governance problems. Technology rarely fails. Organizations fail to structure it. Most people think Microsoft 365 is email, Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive stitched together. It's not. At enterprise scale, it's the operating system for how your organization actually works. And when you treat an operating system like a tool collection, things break in ways that are hard to see coming. This confession isn't a blame exercise. The engineers in these stories were brilliant. The problem is that brilliance applied to the wrong problem creates systems that are technically perfect and operationally impossible. Redefining Microsoft 365 as an operating system. Let me start by reframing how we think about Microsoft 365 entirely. Most organizations see it this way: email, real-time collaboration, file storage, identity management, separate tools, separate problems, separate governance models. But that's not what it is anymore. Microsoft 365 is not a collection of applications. At enterprise scale, it is the operating system for how people work. Think about what an operating system does. It manages resources. It enforces access control. It orchestrates how different applications interact. It determines what runs, when it runs, who can see what output, and what happens if something fails. That's not a metaphor for Microsoft 365. That's what it actually is. When you deploy Teams, you're not just installing a chat application. You're deploying a communication layer that determines how information flows through your organization. When you deploy SharePoint, you're not just building a file repository. You're building the institutional memory system, where knowledge lives, who can find it, how long it persists, whether it's protected or exposed. When you deploy Power Platform on top of that, you're creating automation pathways that touch financial systems, customer data, compliance processes. You're no longer just deploying tools. You're architecting the nervous system of your organization. Here's the problem. Most organizations understand this intellectually. They don't internalize it operationally. A tenant starts small, a few teams, some SharePoint sites, a Power Automate flow or two, because someone figured out they could automate a manual process. In year one, everything feels manageable. The technical team understands what exists. Governance is informal because the scope is small. Then the organization grows. Or adoption accelerates. Or leadership decides everyone needs Teams and modern collaboration. By year 3, the tenant is unrecognizable. Thousands of teams with unclear ownership, SharePoint sites that nobody remembers creating. External sharing enabled in ways that were never explicitly decided. It just happened because defaults are permissive. Power Automate flows triggering other flows in dependency chains that only one person understood. Sensitivity labels that nobody applies. Retention policies that conflict with each other. Guest accounts from partnerships that ended 2 years ago. Admin roles sprawled across 30 people who all have global admin access because it was easier than designing role-based controls. And then something breaks, or an audit happens, or a competitor data breach makes leadership nervous. The moment organizations believe they have a technical problem is the moment they actually have an architectural problem. They call a consulting firm, they hire a technical lead, they invest in advanced security tools, they implement stricter policies, they build better automation. None of that fixes what's actually broken. The real challenge isn't understanding the technology. Microsoft 365 is well engineered. The controls exist. The documentation is thorough. The problem is designing systems that humans can operate sustainably. That distinction matters because here's what happens. Technical solutions applied to governance problems create more governance problems. You implement aggressive conditional access policies. Users find workarounds. You block Power Platform usage. Citizen developers move to personal clouds. You require sensitivity labels on everything. Nobody applies them correctly, so you get false positives and alert fatigue. You've treated an architectural problem as if it were a technical problem. And when you do that, you push the friction somewhere else. The goal of Microsoft 365 architecture isn't to build systems that work on day one. It's to design systems that organizations can still operate 5 years from now. That requires thinking differently about what success means. It means asking whether every technical decision can be maintained when the technical person who built it leaves. It means building governance into the architecture from the beginning, not layering it on after the chaos. That's what we're going to explore in this conversation. Why technical excellence becomes a liability. This is where the confession gets uncomfortable. The best engineers are often the worst architects for enterprise governance. And I say that without judgment. I've worked with brilliant people who understand architecture deeply, who can design role-based access control models that are mathematically elegant, who build Power Platform solutions that solve real problems with elegant elegance. These are not mediocre people. These are people who could work anywhere. The problem is that technical depth creates a blindness to systemic durability. A brilliant engineer solves for, can we do this? A governance architect has to solve for, should we do this, and who manages it in 3 years? Those are different problems, and they require different thinking. Technical people optimize for capability. They ask, what's the most advanced thing we can build with this platform? How can we automate the maximum number of processes? How do we design identity controls that are theoretically perfect? The answer to each of those questions is often technically correct. But technical correctness and operational sustainability are not the same thing. Here's the pattern I've seen over and over. A brilliant architect designs a Microsoft 365 environment. The tenant is perfectly configured. Conditional access policies are granular and risk-aware. Role-based access control is implemented down to the SharePoint site level. Power Platform governance includes environment separation, flow ownership tracking, and connector restrictions. Azure AD is clean. Retention policies are consistent. External sharing is controlled. It's a masterpiece. On day one, it works beautifully. By year 3, it's collapsing silently. Why? Because the organization didn't internalize the governance model. Nobody remembers why the conditional access policies were written that way. The architect who understood the entire role-based access control model left for another job. The Power Platform governance structure created such friction that citizen developers started building flows in personal environments. The retention policies make sense on paper but conflict with how business units actually work, so they're ignored. The external sharing controls are so strict that legitimate partners can't collaborate, so users find workarounds. The system didn't fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was designed for a different organization than the one actually operating it. This is the fundamental split: configuration thinking versus intent-based design. Configuration thinking asks, what settings should we configure? It's tactical, it's specific. You set conditional access policies, you define role assignments, you configure retention labels, you implement DLP rules. All of it is technically sound, all of it works on day one. But configuration thinking treats governance as a problem you solve once. You configure the controls, you document the policies, you hand it off, done. Intent-based design asks, what behavior do we want the system to enforce over time? That's architectural. A brilliant technical architect can design perfect configurations. A governance architect has to ask whether those configurations will survive when the technical person isn't in the room anymore. Will they survive when business requirements change? Will they survive when a new technology gets integrated? Will they survive when the organization acquires another company and needs to merge tenants? The most dangerous architecture is the one that works perfectly on day one and collapses silently by year 3. It collapses quietly because there's no dramatic failure. Things still run, but the system has become unmaintainable. The governance has drifted. The configurations no longer align with organizational reality. The controls require constant manual intervention. The compliance audit uncovers dozens of policy exceptions that nobody documents anymore. And then you discover the real problem. The original architects solved for technical perfection instead of organizational sustainability. This isn't a blame exercise. The engineers in those stories were brilliant. That's the point. The problem is that brilliance applied to the wrong problem creates systems that are technically perfect and operationally impossible. An organization can't operate a perfectly optimized technical solution if nobody understands why the optimization exists. That's the confession. The best technical minds in the room often create the worst governance outcomes, not because they're incompetent, but because they're answering a different question than the organization needs answered. The 3 governance zones framework. Before we dive into the failures, let me introduce the framework that prevents them. Most organizations treat all data the same way. They apply one set of governance rules across everything. That's the fundamental mistake. Microsoft 365 isn't a single system. It's 3 different systems operating at different scales, serving different purposes, requiring different governance models. Once you see those 3 zones, the entire governance problem becomes simpler. Zone 1 is personal work, OneDrive, personal Teams chats, the stuff you're working on that doesn't need to be shared with anyone. This zone should be user-controlled with minimal governance. The person owns their content. They can organize it however they want. They can share it with whoever they want. Nobody needs to label it or review it or enforce retention. The organizational overhead on Zone 1 should be almost 0. Zone 2 is collaborative work, Teams channels, project sites, marketing campaigns, product launches, customer engagements. This is where teams collaborate on things that matter but aren't regulated. This zone should be team managed with moderate governance. You need owner accountability. You need lifecycle rules. If a project ends, the site gets archived, not left orphaned forever. You need clear sharing policies. You need someone to own the space and be responsible for whether the right people have access. But you don't need the operational burden of treating every Teams channel like it contains financial records. Zone 3 is enterprise records. HR data, finance, regulated content, anything that has compliance implications or legal hold requirements. This is where you need strict governance. Sensitivity labels are mandatory. Retention policies are enforced. Access is reviewed regularly. External sharing is restricted. Everything is logged. Everything is auditable. That's it. 3 zones, 3 governance models. This model instantly simplifies governance design. It prevents scope creep. It prevents the situation where you build a governance framework designed for enterprise records, then try to apply it to personal work, and suddenly your organization can't function because people can't organize their own files without approval chains. Most failures occur when organizations treat all 3 zones with identical governance. They build a perfect governance model for Zone 3, strict controls, careful oversight, compliance-driven. Then they apply it to Zone 2. Suddenly teams becomes friction, collaboration slows down. People find workarounds. They apply it to Zone 1. People start using personal cloud storage because organizational OneDrive is too controlled. You've just created shadow IT, not solved a governance problem. The framework works because it separates 3 things that most organizations conflate: presentation, logic, and data. Presentation is what users see. The interface, the experience, that should adapt to the zone. Zone 1 should feel frictionless. Zone 3 should feel controlled and auditable. Logic is governance. The rules, the policies, the controls, that should be appropriate to the zone, not uniform across all zones. Data is the actual content. That should be protected according to its sensitivity, not according to which zone it happens to sit in. Intent-based governance asks, what behavior do we want the system to enforce over time? In Zone 1, we want to enable personal productivity without organizational overhead. In Zone 2, we want to enable collaboration with clear ownership. In Zone 3, we want compliance and auditability. Configuration thinking asks, what settings should we configure? And that's where chaos begins. You configure policies, you layer them, you create exceptions, you document them. And 6 months later, the actual behavior of the system no longer matches any documentation. Intent-based governance survives. Configuration thinking collapses. This framework is the foundation. Every governance decision flows from it, which is why most organizations get governance so wrong. They never define the zones. They never make explicit what behavior they actually want. So they end up with a configuration mess that nobody can maintain. So, Case Study 1. The Automation Hydra. Let's start with the first failure pattern I've seen repeatedly. I call it the Automation Hydra. This one starts with a legitimate business problem. A mid-market organization has a manual process that's slow. Sales collateral needs to go through approval. Invoices need to be routed to the right cost center. Customer data needs to sync between systems. Someone says, we could automate this. A brilliant automation engineer, or in modern organizations, a citizen developer with Power Platform training builds a Power Automate flow. It works, it solves the problem. Processing time drops. Manual errors drop. It's a success. Success breeds expansion. Can we automate this other process? Yes, we can. Another flow, this one's more complex. It touches more systems. It reads data from SharePoint, writes to Dynamics, sends approvals through Teams. Still works beautifully. 6 months in, the automation program is seen as a win. Leadership wants more. Business units request flows for their own processes. The citizen developer ecosystem explodes. 30 flows, 50 flows, 100 flows. By this point, something has changed fundamentally, but nobody notices yet because the flows still work. The problem isn't that the flows are broken. The problem is that they've become interdependent in ways nobody explicitly designed. Flow A triggers Flow B. Flow B modifies data that Flow C depends on. Flow C writes to a list that Flow D reads from. These dependencies accumulate invisibly because they emerge from individual business problems being solved locally, not from a system being designed holistically. Then something changes. A business requirement shifts. Someone updates Flow A to handle a new case type. That update ripples through the dependency chain. Flow B breaks because it wasn't expecting the new data format. Flow C starts generating errors. 3 hours later, business processes are failing across the organization. The person who built Flow A is trying to debug why downstream systems are broken. But they never explicitly documented that Flow A was connected to Flow B. They just knew it in their head. This is the moment most organizations realize they have a problem. The symptoms are chaos. Business processes breaking unexpectedly, IT scrambling to restore service, nobody knowing the actual ownership chain, rollbacks that take hours because you can't just revert Flow A, you have to understand how it cascades through the entire automation ecosystem. I've seen organizations report hundreds of flows with no clear ownership, thousands of flows with undocumented dependencies, a single update that cascaded through dozens of flows in ways nobody predicted. The core problem is simple. Automation without lifecycle governance creates a system that nobody can maintain. This isn't a technical problem. The flows are well written. The platform works perfectly. The issue is architectural. Citizen developers were empowered to build solutions. That's good. But nobody owned the system as a whole. There was no lifecycle governance. No one was tracking what flows existed, who built them, what they depended on, whether they were still needed. There was no continuous monitoring of the automation ecosystem as a living system. Power Platform governance requires 3 things: ownership, lifecycle management, and continuous monitoring. Ownership means every flow has a documented owner who understands what it does and what it depends on. not a generic IT owns this. A person, someone accountable. Lifecycle management means flows have a defined lifespan. When the business process changes, the flow gets updated or archived. When the person who built it leaves, someone else becomes responsible. You don't accumulate orphaned flows that run forever because nobody remembers what they do. Continuous monitoring means you're watching the automation ecosystem as a system. You're tracking dependencies, you're measuring failure rates, you're understanding how changes in one flow affect others. You're treating automation as infrastructure that requires oversight, not just as a collection of individual problems solved independently. Without these three things, automation becomes entropy. The system still works. Technically, the flows keep running, but nobody controls it anymore. You've created a black box of automation that the organization is now dependent on but can't actually manage. And here's the uncomfortable part, the technical solution. Building more automation, adding more flows, deploying more sophisticated logic makes the problem worse. Each new flow increases the complexity and interdependency of the system. You haven't solved the governance problem. You've expanded it. This is why brilliant automation architects can create the worst governance outcomes. They solve the technical problem beautifully. They just never ask who's going to maintain the system when I'm not here. Why automation entropy happens. The automation hydra doesn't appear overnight. Let me walk you through how it develops. It starts with a legitimate business need. Some manual process is slow. Invoices sit in inboxes waiting for approval. Customer data doesn't sync between systems. Someone notices the inefficiency and says, we could automate this. A citizen developer, or sometimes a brilliant technical architect who's been tasked with modernizing legacy processes, builds a Power Automate flow. It's straightforward. Read data from one system, apply business logic, write to another system, send notifications. It works. It solves the actual problem. Processing time drops. Manual errors disappear. The organization sees immediate value. That's not where the failure begins. That's where success begins. And success creates the conditions for failure. Because once leadership sees that automation works, the question changes. It's no longer, should we automate this? It becomes, how many more processes can we automate? Citizen developers start getting requests. Finance wants to automate invoice routing. Sales wants to automate collateral approvals. HR wants to automate onboarding. Each request is legitimate. Each flow solves a real problem. But here's what's happening underneath that success. Dependencies are accumulating invisibly. The first few flows are simple, independent. They don't interact. But by the 10th flow, something has shifted. Flow A reads from a SharePoint list. Flow B writes to the same list. Nobody explicitly decided they should interact. It just happened because both flows needed access to the same data. But now Flow B's output is becoming Flow A's input. Flow C joins the ecosystem. It monitors an email inbox and creates tasks in a list that Flow D depends on. Flow D triggers Flow E, which modifies records that Flow A reads. You now have 5 flows, and they're connected in ways that only the developers who built them understand, and only in their heads. Nobody has mapped these dependencies. There's no diagram. There's no documentation that says if you change Flow B, you need to check whether Flow A will still work. The connections emerged organically from individual problem solving. Each flow was designed to solve a specific business problem in isolation. Nobody designed how they interact as a system. This is the definition of technical debt in the automation space. It's not a broken flow. It's invisible coupling. Most organizations lack visibility into what flows exist, who owns them, or what data they touch. They know flows are running, they see the business value, but they don't know the actual architecture. If a citizen developer leaves, that person's flows become orphaned knowledge. If a business requirement changes and someone needs to update a flow, they don't know what else might break downstream. The governance failure isn't building the flows. It's failing to design a system that can sustain them. Technical people, whether citizen developers or architects, were solving the right problem locally. They were automating manual processes. They were reducing errors. They were delivering business value. But they were solving the wrong problem globally. They weren't asking, how will the organization maintain this automation ecosystem in 2 years? What happens when 500 flows exist and nobody can trace the dependencies? What happens when a critical flow breaks at 2 in the morning and the person who built it is unreachable? Most organizations discover they have an automation entropy problem only when something breaks. And by that point, the system is complex enough that fixing it requires either reverse engineering the entire flow ecosystem or rebuilding it from scratch. The path to the automation hydra is paved with good intentions and incremental local decisions. Each flow was the right choice. None of them, individually, created the problem. The problem emerged from treating automation as a collection of independent solutions instead of treating it as infrastructure that needs governance. That's why the most dangerous automation programs are the successful ones. Success hides the structural problem until it's too late to fix it easily. Case study 2. The security fortress. Now let's look at the second failure pattern, when security architecture becomes operational friction. This one starts differently. There's no gradual drift. There's no accumulated legacy. This one is designed from the ground up to be secure. A technically brilliant security architect, someone who understands zero trust principles deeply, Who can explain conditional access policies and device compliance in detail? Who knows the NIST cybersecurity framework code, gets tasked with designing a modern security model, and they design something perfect. Aggressive conditional access policies that evaluate risk on every authentication attempt. Strict device compliance requirements that only allow managed devices to access corporate resources. MFA required for everything, enforced consistently. External sharing restricted to pre-approved domains. Heavy controls on what applications can be installed. Careful monitoring of data movement. All technically sound, all best practice aligned, all defensible in an audit. It's a fortress. On day one, it works beautifully. The security baseline is tighter than it's ever been. Threat intelligence systems light up fewer threats because the attack surface is reduced. The security team feels confident. Leadership feels protected. The architecture is exactly what Microsoft and every security framework recommends. By month 3, the organization has quietly disabled it, not officially. Nobody announces that the fortress is coming down. Instead, users start finding workarounds. Personal Dropbox. WhatsApp file transfers to send documents outside the secure system. Shadow SaaS tools where collaborative work actually happens. Employees access work email from personal devices because the compliance requirements on corporate devices are too onerous. Project teams maintain Google Drive folders because SharePoint access is too restricted. Sales uses a personal Slack workspace because the corporate team's implementation requires too many approvals for external guest access. The security architecture was perfect, the human behavior defeated it. Here's the paradox. Security that ignores human behavior eventually weakens security. You've designed a system so restrictive that it makes people's jobs harder. They don't become more secure, they become creative. And their creativity bypasses your controls entirely. The research is clear on this. Around 80% of SaaS breaches originate from misconfiguration or user behavior, not from platform vulnerabilities or sophisticated attacks. Users circumventing security controls. Misconfigured permissions. Oversharing because approval processes are too slow. Shadow IT because official channels can't keep up. But here's what's important to understand. Users don't circumvent security because they're reckless or incompetent. They circumvent it because the system makes their job impossible. A sales team that can't share documents with a customer without a 3-day approval process will email the files to personal accounts instead. A finance team that can't get access to a critical tool in time for month-end closes will find a workaround. A project team that can't invite a contractor without IT involvement will use personal cloud storage. The architect who designed the fortress designed it for a theoretical organization. The organization that actually operates requires flexibility that the fortress doesn't allow. Shadow IT isn't a security problem. It's a governance problem. It's the symptom of a system that's optimized for control instead of optimized for sustainable operation. You can make security tighter and tighter. You can reduce the attack surface. You can enforce more policies. But if the cost of compliance is higher than the cost of circumvention, people will circumvent. The most dangerous security architecture is the one that's technically perfect but operationally impossible. Because it forces a choice. Follow the rules and don't work, or work and don't follow the rules. Most people choose to work. This is where the confession gets uncomfortable. The brilliant security architect designed a perfect fortress. But the organization didn't need a fortress. It needed a city. It needed a system where security existed within the actual workflow of how people work, not as friction layered on top of it. It needed conditional access policies that evaluated risk, but didn't require users to re-authenticate every time they switched between applications. It needed device compliance that was enforced intelligently, not with blanket restrictions that made remote work impossible. It needed external sharing controls that protected sensitive data without making legitimate collaboration impossible. The technical solution wasn't wrong. The problem was solving for the wrong organization. The architect solved for an organization that valued security above all else. But the actual organization valued security and productivity. And when those two things conflict, governance has to make a choice about which one wins. That choice can't be made by a perfect technical control. It has to be made by an architect who understands both the security requirement and the organizational reality. Why security friction creates shadow IT. This pattern repeats in organizations across industries. Let me explain why it happens. Technical security architects optimize for control and risk reduction. That's their job. They're asked to make the environment more secure. So they ask the right question from a security perspective. Like, what's the most restrictive policy we can enforce while still allowing work? But they don't ask the follow-up question that governance architects need to ask. What will users do when they can't work within these restrictions? So those are different questions and they lead to different answers. Conditional access policies that require specific devices, like a corporate laptop managed through Intune, with specific security configurations, sound reasonable from a security standpoint. You're controlling which devices can access corporate resources. But if you exclude remote workers on home networks or contractors who don't have access to corporate hardware or employees traveling internationally, you've created a problem. Those people still need to work. So they find workarounds. MFA prompts that trigger too frequently create alert fatigue. The user sees the MFA notification. They approve it without thinking. Then they see another one. And another one, pretty soon they're approving MFA prompts on autopilot without actually verifying that they initiated the request. An attacker sends a MFA push notification during a phishing attack, the user approves it in muscle memory, and you've just defeated your own security control. External sharing restrictions that prevent legitimate collaboration sound protective until you realize that a sales team actually needs to share documents with customers. A consultant needs to collaborate with a partner firm. A nonprofit needs to work with their board. You've restricted sharing so heavily that the business can't actually operate. So people use personal email or Dropbox or Google Drive shared folders or OneDrive links that they email from their personal Gmail account because corporate email has restrictions. The core insight is this: security that ignores operational reality creates operational insecurity. You're designing controls for a theoretical organization that values security above all else. The actual organization needs to work. And when your security controls prevent work, you haven't made the organization more secure. You forced it to operate outside your controls. Research tells us something interesting. Organizations estimate their employees use about 37 approved applications. The actual number they use is around 625 different apps. That's a 17-fold discrepancy. That's not a user problem. That's a governance architecture problem. The technical solution of restricting access and implementing tighter controls doesn't address the underlying problem. It makes it worse, because when approval processes are too slow or technically rigid or require expertise users don't have, users solve their own problems. They find tools that work faster. They use SaaS applications that don't require IT approval. They adopt AI tools that make their job easier. They bypass the system. And here's the uncomfortable part. The technical solution, more restrictions, actually increases the attack surface you're trying to protect, because now you have unknown applications accessing corporate data. You have unapproved integrations you can't monitor. You have file storage systems you didn't choose and can't control. You have communication channels you didn't architect and can't secure. An employee is using their personal Gmail, their personal Dropbox, their personal Slack workspace, their personal ChatGPT account. If their personal account gets compromised, the attacker has access to corporate information, and you have no visibility into where that data went or how it's being used. The fortress didn't make the organization more secure. It fragmented the security architecture. It pushed sensitive information outside the systems you can monitor and control. It created a shadow IT ecosystem that your security tools can't see. That's the paradox of security friction. The tighter you make legitimate workflows, the more you drive work outside those workflows. And the more work happens outside your controls, the more risk you've actually introduced. This is where intent-based governance becomes essential. Instead of asking what's the most restrictive policy we can enforce, ask how do we protect sensitive data while enabling the organization to work. Those lead to completely different architecture. Case study 3, the Copilot stall. The third failure pattern is newer, but it's becoming the most common. I call it the Copilot stall. Organizations pilot Copilot with enthusiasm. Week 1, adoption metrics are impressive. Employees are excited about an AI assistant that understands their organization. Leadership approves the investment. The pilot expands. More users get licenses. More use cases emerge. Meeting recaps, email drafting, document generation, it all works. And then, between week 6 and 12, the rollout stops. Not because Copilot is broken, not because the technology failed. The rollout stops because AI instantly surfaces governance debt that the organization has been accumulating for years. Copilot doesn't just answer questions. It aggregates data, it reads emails, it searches Teams, it accesses SharePoint, it crawls OneDrive, it understands context across the entire Microsoft 365 environment. And when it starts surfacing information, it reveals things that were previously hidden by obscurity. Broken permissions, SharePoint sites where access is set to everyone in the organization, documents shared via anyone with the link that have been circulating for 2 years, external sharing that was supposed to be restricted but never was because the defaults were permissive and no one enforced it, guest accounts from partnerships that ended years ago still retaining access to sensitive files, sensitivity labels that were never applied, retention policies that conflict with each other. All of this existed before Copilot. The governance debt was real, but it was invisible because finding the information was hard. A document shared with everyone in the organization wasn't a problem if nobody thought to search for it. An external link that exposed customer data wasn't visible to the security team if they didn't audit SharePoint links specifically. Permission sprawl existed, but it didn't manifest as an operational problem because accessing that data at scale required deliberate effort. Copilot changes that calculus. An AI system can access and surface all of that information instantly. If an account is compromised and an attacker has Copilot access, they can accelerate internal reconnaissance and sensitive data harvesting at scale. Ask Copilot for customer contracts. Copilot searches SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams and finds them because access controls haven't been enforced. Ask Copilot for financial forecasts. Copilot surfaces them from shared drives and email attachments because they've been shared too broadly. Most organizations don't discover they have permission sprawl until Copilot exposes it. Research tells us that around 73% of AI agent deployments fail to scale beyond pilots due to governance failures. Not technical failures, governance failures. The organizations running the pilots realize they have deeper infrastructure problems than they thought. Permission sprawl, unmanaged external sharing, data that's sensitive but classified as public, files that should be restricted but are accessible to contractors or partners from years-old partnerships. And at that point, leadership gets nervous. Security teams get nervous. If Copilot can see this information, what can attackers see? What happens if an account gets compromised? What happens if external partners retain access to data we forgot about? The rollout stalls while the organization tries to fix underlying governance problems, but those problems are bigger and more pervasive than anyone realized. Cleaning up permission sprawl across thousands of SharePoint sites takes months. Auditing and removing inappropriate external sharing takes months. Enforcing sensitivity labels on existing content takes months. By the time the organization is ready to scale Copilot, the pilot momentum is gone. Leadership has moved on to other priorities. The core insight is this: AI doesn't create governance problems, it reveals them instantly. Most organizations have years of permission sprawl that technical people ignored because the system was functioning. From a technical perspective, if people could access the files they needed, the system was working. Permission management seemed like a compliance problem, not an operational one. So it was deferred, pushed to the next year, treated as something to address eventually. Then Copilot arrives and makes the deferred problem urgent. The technical teams build Copilot perfectly. The AI works beautifully. The integration with Microsoft 365 is seamless. The capability is real, but the organization wasn't ready to operate it safely. The governance foundation wasn't solid enough to support an AI system that could access everything. This is why the most dangerous moment in technology adoption is right before the capability gets deployed. That's when your governance debt becomes visible. The permission sprawl reality. To understand the Copilot stall, you need to understand permission sprawl. And to understand permission sprawl, you have to understand how it accumulates. It's not the result of a single bad decision. It's the result of years of small, reasonable decisions that all point in the same direction. Someone creates a SharePoint site for a project. The site privacy settings default to everyone in the organization can access this. That seems reasonable at the time. The project is organization-wide. Everyone should be able to find it. So nobody changes the setting. Years later, the project is done. The site gets archived. But before it gets archived, someone uploads the latest customer contract there. Someone else stores the project budget. Another person archives client communications. All in a site set to everyone in the organization. Meanwhile, in OneDrive, a user shares a folder with anyone with the link. They're collaborating with a consultant on a proposal. The link makes it easy to share. Both of them can edit. It works beautifully. The consultant finishes the engagement. The link gets forwarded to a friend at another company who's starting a similar project. Nobody revokes the link because nobody remembers it exists. It's still active, still accessible, still sharing whatever files the user added to that folder. In Teams, a channel is set to public by default. Team owners don't have to explicitly allow access. Everyone in the organization can join. Someone posts a sensitive internal analysis, someone else shares competitive intelligence. Someone posts salary information by accident. The default permissions don't prevent any of this. Nobody has enforced a policy about what should be shared in public channels versus private channels. Permission inheritance in SharePoint gets broken through routine administrative tasks. The IT team creates a site template. They set permissions at the site level. A team adds a subfolder for sensitive documents. They think they've restricted access to that subfolder, but the permissions inheritance is broken. The folder inherits permissions from the parent site, which is set to broad access. Nobody notices because the system is functioning. Files are accessible. People can do their jobs. These aren't failures. Each decision made sense locally. Opening the site to everyone in the organization was the right call for that project. Using anyone with the link sharing was the right choice for that collaboration. Public Teams channels are useful. Site-level permissions are simpler than granular folder permissions. But over time, something that made sense individually becomes a problem systemically. Permission sprawl is the accumulated result of years of just share it with everyone decisions layered on top of each other. The research is sobering. 15% or more of business-critical files are at risk due to oversharing or misconfigured access. That's not a small number. That's a structural problem. It means that across most large organizations, a significant portion of sensitive data is accessible to people who shouldn't have access to it. Not because of a breach, not because of a security vulnerability, because of permission sprawl. Here's what makes permission sprawl invisible. When data is difficult to find, access doesn't become a problem. A customer contract shared with everyone in the organization isn't dangerous if finding that contract requires knowing the exact SharePoint site, navigating to the right folder, and searching through dozens of files. The access exists, but the information is practically hidden, so the security problem remains theoretical. But Copilot makes all of it discoverable instantly. Ask Copilot to summarize all customer contracts. Copilot searches, Copilot finds them, Copilot surfaces the information. The permission sprawl that was invisible becomes operationally obvious. Technical people often ignored permission sprawl for exactly this reason. The system was functioning, users could access what they needed, performance was fine. From a technical standpoint, everything was working. From a governance standpoint, the system had catastrophically failed. That distinction is crucial. A system that functions but can't be controlled is not actually functioning. Permission sprawl isn't a technical problem. It's an architectural failure, the failure to design access controls that remain maintainable as the organization evolves. Case study 4, the identity collapse. The fourth failure pattern is perhaps the most insidious because it's invisible until it becomes catastrophic. I call it the identity collapse. This one starts with good intentions. An organization builds out their Azure AD instance, now called Entra ID, with care. A few applications get integrated, a few hundred user accounts, some basic administrative structure. Everything is clean, everything is documented. Then the organization grows. Or they acquire another company, or they integrate a new application ecosystem. And Azure AD grows with it. 5 years later, the tenant has hundreds of applications integrated. Guest accounts from partnerships, contractors, vendors, thousands of them, many from partnerships that ended years ago. Global admin roles are scattered across the organization. The CIO has one. The IT director has one. The infrastructure lead has one. A couple of contractors who build custom integrations have one. Someone in finance who manages integrations has one. Someone in HR who manages employee lifecycle processes has one. Why so many global admins? Because Azure AD and Microsoft 365 use a centralized admin model. It's all or nothing. You either have global admin rights and can do anything to anyone, or you have limited permissions and can't do your job. There's no middle ground without significant effort. So when someone needs the ability to create security groups, the quickest solution is to give them global admin. When someone needs to manage app permissions, global admin. When someone needs to reset a password for a VIP, global admin, pretty soon you have 10 or 15 people with global admin access. And the problem isn't that these people are incompetent or malicious. The problem is that identity complexity has become invisible technical debt. Here's the core issue. Technical people often grant global admin rights, not because it's the right choice, but because the alternative, designing granular role-based access control, is too complex. A brilliant architect could sit down and design a perfect model. They could use Azure AD's built-in roles. They could create custom roles with granular permissions. They could design a delegation model where admins have just enough privilege to do their jobs and nothing more. That model would be theoretically perfect, but it would take weeks to design and months to implement and maintain. And the person who designed it would have to stay around to explain it to everyone else. It's easier to just give people global admin and move on. That decision creates a system where anyone with global admin can do anything to anyone. They can read anyone's email. They can access anyone's files. They can change password policies. They can disable MFA. They can create new admin accounts. They can integrate malicious applications. They can modify conditional access policies. A single compromised GA account means the entire organization is compromised. And here's what happens next. When admin complexity increases, organizations don't grant less privilege. They grant more. Because the only way to solve the problem of too many admins with too much power is to give more people too much power so you have redundancy. Research tells us something striking. 90% of organizations grant excessive administrative privileges in Microsoft 365. 90%, that's not an outlier. That's the norm. That's the natural outcome of the centralized admin model combined with the complexity of the platform. The identity collapse isn't a technical failure. It's an architectural failure to design sustainable delegation. A brilliant architect can design role-based access control that's theoretically perfect. But if the organization can't sustain that design, if it requires constant maintenance, if it's too complex for other admins to understand, if it creates bottlenecks that force people to work around it, then the design has failed. The collapsed identity architecture is the symptom. The root cause is an admin model that forces a choice between perfect controls that are unmaintainable or simple controls that are dangerously permissive. Most organizations choose permissive, and they pay for it with identity sprawl. This is different from the other failures because it's not about a specific capability implemented poorly. It's about a fundamental architectural assumption that didn't survive contact with organizational reality. Microsoft 365 assumes you'll design granular delegation. It gives you the tools, but it doesn't acknowledge that designing those controls requires expertise and ongoing effort. So most organizations just hand out global admin and hope nothing goes wrong. By the time the organization realizes they have a problem, usually because an admin account gets compromised or an audit reveals excessive privilege, the identity architecture has collapsed so far that fixing it requires months of work. And the worst part, the original architects weren't wrong. They were solving the problem they were given. They were just solving it in a way that created a bigger problem down the line. Why technical people miss governance problems? Now let's step back and understand why brilliant technical people create these failures. It's not malice, it's not incompetence. It's a difference in how technical minds and governance minds frame problems. Technical thinking is optimized for solving defined problems with measurable solutions. You have a problem, you analyze it, you design a solution, you implement it, you measure whether it works. Success is binary. Either it works or it doesn't. Either the flow processes invoices correctly or it doesn't. Either the conditional access policy blocks unauthorized access or it doesn't. Either the role-based access control model grants the right permissions or it doesn't. Governance is fundamentally different. Governance is about preventing undefined future problems through architectural design. The problem isn't defined yet. You're trying to anticipate what might go wrong 3 years from now. You're trying to design structures that will survive when requirements change. You're trying to create systems that people you've never met will be able to understand and maintain. These are fundamentally different cognitive tasks, and they require different thinking. Technical excellence creates a particular blindness. When you've designed something perfectly, when the configuration is elegant, when the logic is sound, when the system works beautifully on day one, you have confidence in that solution. That confidence is justified. You've done your job well, but that same confidence can mask governance blindness because technically the solution is correct. Performance is optimal. The controls work as designed. It's easy to conclude that the problem is solved. But here's the truth. A perfectly configured tenant is seductive. It creates the impression that you've solved a governance problem when you've only solved a technical problem. Governance isn't solved. It's continuously maintained. You don't build a governance model and declare it complete. You build a governance model and then you spend the next 5 years adapting it as the organization evolves. Requirements change. Technology changes. People leave and new people arrive. Business units reorganize. New applications get integrated. New compliance requirements emerge. A governance architecture that doesn't evolve is a governance architecture that's failing. Technical people often treat governance as a checklist. Create policies, document them, move on. You've done your job. Now governance is someone else's responsibility. But that's not how governance works. Governance is a living system. It requires continuous oversight. It requires regular adaptation. It requires someone to ask, is this policy still working? Not just, was this policy created? The best technical architects I've worked with are the ones who learned to think in systems. They didn't stop thinking technically. They didn't become less competent engineers, but they learned to ask a different question. A brilliant architect asks, does this work today? A governance architect asks, what will this decision look like in 3 years? That's the shift. Will this be maintainable when the person who built it leaves? Will this make sense to someone reading the documentation 6 months from now? Will this decision scale to 200 SharePoint sites or 200 Power Automate flows? What happens when the business requirement changes? What happens when the technology gets updated? What happens when the organization grows? Those are governance questions. They're not sexy. They don't require deep technical knowledge. They require thinking about operational reality. They require humble acknowledgement that perfect technical solutions often create imperfect human problems. The shift from technical thinking to architectural thinking is the shift from can we do this to should we do this and who manages it in 3 years. Most technical people never make that shift. They're not taught to. The incentive systems reward technical excellence, not governance durability. A brilliant architecture that works beautifully for 3 years and collapses in year 4 doesn't get credit for the 3 years. It gets blamed for the collapse. But the architects who learn to think about organizational reality instead of just technical perfection are the ones who create systems that actually survive. They design for the organization that exists, not the one they wish existed. They ask uncomfortable questions about maintainability. They accept that perfect technical solutions sometimes need to be compromised to be sustainable. That distinction between technical excellence and governance durability is the line between creating great systems and creating systems that organizations can actually operate. The intent-based governance shift. This is where we move from diagnosing failures to preventing them. Most organizations approach governance backwards. They start with implementation. They ask, what settings should we configure? What policies should we write? What controls should we deploy? And they end up with a document that describes the configuration along with a set of controls that will drift from that documentation within 6 months because the world changed and the documentation didn't. Intent-based governance inverts that question. Instead of starting with implementation, you start with intent. You ask, what behavior do we want the system to enforce? Not forever, because forever is a lie, but over the time horizon that matters for your organization, over the next 3 years, over the next business cycle. This shift changes everything about how architecture is designed. Configuration thinking leads to policy documents that drift from reality. You write a policy, you say, external sharing is restricted to approved domains. That's specific, that's measurable, that's a configuration you can implement, but 6 months later, a business unit needs to share with a partner that's not on the approved list. They request an exception, you add the exception. 6 months later, another request, another exception. After a year, your approved domains list has grown to include so many domains that it's functionally unrestricted. The policy document says one thing, the configuration does something else. The actual behavior is a third thing entirely. Intent-based thinking leads to principles that guide decision-making over time. Instead of saying external sharing is restricted to approved domains, ask how do we enable legitimate collaboration while protecting sensitive data? That's a principle. It's not a specific configuration. It's a question that should guide every external sharing decision. How do we balance the business need for collaboration with the security need for protection? That principle can be implemented in multiple ways. You could use approved domains. You could use sensitivity labels to restrict what data can be shared externally. You could use conditional access to verify the external user's identity. You could use DLP policies to prevent sensitive data from leaving the organization. You could use a combination of all of these. The principle doesn't prescribe the implementation, it guides it. The first statement, external sharing is restricted to approved domains, is a configuration that will be circumvented the moment it conflicts with a business need. The second statement, we enable collaboration while protecting sensitive data, is an intent that can guide multiple configurations. And when you need to change the configuration because a business requirement evolved, you can adapt it without changing the principle. Intent-based governance is more durable than configuration thinking because it survives configuration changes. When you know the intent, you can adapt the implementation as the organization evolves. A new business partner joins your organization. They're not on the approved domains list, but they're a legitimate collaborator. The principle says enable collaboration while protecting sensitive data. So you add the domain. You haven't violated the principle. You've applied it to a new circumstance. Configuration thinking can't do that without creating policy drift. Intent-based thinking can do it without abandoning the governance model. This is the fundamental shift from technical architecture to governance architecture. Technical architecture optimizes for capability. How do we build the most sophisticated system? How do we automate the most processes? How do we create the most granular access controls? Governance architecture optimizes for durability. How do we build a system the organization can still operate in 3 years? How do we design governance that survives when requirements change? How do we create principles that guide decision-making when we can't predict every future scenario? Most organizations never make this shift. They hire a brilliant technical architect. That architect designs perfect configurations. They document them meticulously. They hand it off. And the organization tries to operate that perfect system in the real world, where business requirements change every quarter and technology evolves every month. The system gradually becomes unmaintainable, not because the original design was flawed, but because the design was optimized for a fictional organization, not the real one. Intent-based governance works because it acknowledges a fundamental truth. You can't predict the future. You don't know what business requirements will emerge 3 years from now. You don't know what new technology will need to integrate with Microsoft 365. You don't know what compliance requirement will be imposed. But you can define principles that will guide good decisions even when circumstances change. That's the shift. From how do we configure this perfectly today to how do we design principles that will guide this organization sustainably. Designing for durability, not just capability. Durability is the metric that technical people often miss, and it's the metric that determines whether a system survives or whether it quietly collapses. A system is durable if the organization can still operate it in 3 years, not on day one, not with perfect conditions. 3 years from now, with different people, with changed requirements, with evolved technology, can the organization still maintain this system? Can someone who didn't build it understand how it works? Can it adapt when circumstances change? That's durability. Durability requires clarity about 3 things. Ownership. Someone must be accountable for this system, not just initially, but continuously. Lifecycle management. The system must have mechanisms to age gracefully, to archive what's no longer needed, to retire what's obsolete. And continuous monitoring. Someone must be watching whether the system is still achieving its intent, not just whether it's technically functioning. Here's where the tension emerges. Technical excellence and durability are often in opposition. The most capable system is often the least durable. Why? Because it requires constant technical intervention. It requires the architect who designed it to stay engaged. It requires specialized expertise. It requires people to understand subtle dependencies and complex configurations. A perfectly optimized system that only the original architect understands is brilliant on day 1 and unmaintainable on day 431. The most durable system is often less capable. It trades some functionality for simplicity. It accepts good enough instead of perfect. It asks, do we need this feature if it doubles the complexity? It designs for the lowest common denominator of expertise. It documents extensively because it knows the person maintaining it won't have the designer's context. Governance architecture finds the balance between those 2 extremes. Not maximum capability, not maximum simplicity, the right capability for the organization, the right complexity the organization can sustain. And that balance is different for every organization. A small organization that's growing fast might need more capability and can tolerate less durability because the person who built the system is still there. They can adapt quickly. A large enterprise organization that moves slowly might need less capability but much more durability because the person who built the system left years ago and the system is operated by people who have 800 other responsibilities. Technical people often push toward maximum capability without considering the durability cost. They ask, what's possible? What's the most sophisticated thing we can build? What's the most elegant solution? Those are good questions, but they're not governance questions. Governance architects ask a different question. They ask, what's the minimum capability we need? Not what's possible, what's necessary. And then they ask, what's the maximum complexity we can sustain? Not forever. Over the next 3 to 5 years, with the people we have, with the expertise we can realistically maintain, how much complexity can we actually manage? Those two questions, minimum capability and maximum sustainable complexity, completely reframe the architecture. Instead of asking, how sophisticated can we make this? You ask, how simple can we make this while still solving the problem? Instead of designing for an ideal state where everything is perfectly configured and optimized, you design for the realistic state where things degrade over time and someone needs to be able to fix them without calling the original architect. This reframing prevents the failures we've discussed. The automation hydra doesn't emerge if you ask, what's the maximum number of flows we can sustain and actually monitor? Not unlimited, not as many as we want. A specific number that the organization can manage. 500 flows? Maybe. 5,000 flows with no ownership? No, that exceeds the organization's capacity to maintain it. The security fortress doesn't get built if you ask, what's the minimum control we need while still protecting sensitive data? Not maximum control, minimum. What's the simplest policy that achieves the security goal while staying operable? The Copilot stall doesn't happen if you ask, what's our governance capacity before we deploy AI at scale? Not what's technically possible. What can we actually sustain? Do we have permission governance under control? Do we have sensitivity labels applied? Do we have a process for managing external access? If not, scale the AI slower while you build the governance foundation. The identity collapse doesn't occur if you ask, what delegation model can we actually maintain? Not the theoretically perfect RBAC model, a model that's simple enough that other people can understand it and sustain it. Durability changes everything. It converts the question from how good can we make this to how good can we make this and still manage it. And that's the question that separates architects who build systems from architects who build systems that organizations can actually operate. The role of organizational readiness. Technical failures often mask organizational failures. Let me explain. When a Microsoft 365 deployment goes sideways, the first instinct is to blame the technology. The system is too complex. The platform has too many features. The configuration is difficult. Those are real frustrations. But they're often not the actual problem. The actual problem is that the organization wasn't ready to operate the capability. An organization is ready for a capability when it can sustain it over time, not on day one with perfect conditions and the person who designed it standing by to explain everything. 3 months in, 6 months in, a year in. When the original project team has moved on to other priorities and someone new is trying to understand how it works. That's when readiness matters. Readiness includes 5 specific things. First, clear ownership. Someone is explicitly responsible for this system. Not IT generally, not a team that has 8 other responsibilities. A person or a small team that owns this capability and knows they'll be held accountable if it fails. Second, documented processes, not just the configuration, but the process. How do people request access? How do you onboard a new user? What's the approval workflow? Who decides whether something is working or not? Third, training. People who operate the system understand it. They know what it's supposed to do. They know how to troubleshoot basic problems. They know who to call when something breaks. Fourth, monitoring. Someone is continuously watching the system. Usage metrics, configuration drift, policy exceptions, performance. Someone's job includes keeping an eye on this. Fifth, governance. There's a governance model that guides decisions. It's not just policy documents. It's a living framework that helps people make the right decision when circumstances change. Most organizations deploy capabilities before they're ready for any of those 5 things. Technical people often deploy because the technology is ready. The configuration is perfect. The feature works beautifully. From a technical standpoint, you can deploy, so you do, but the organization isn't ready. Nobody's been assigned to own it. There's no documented process for how it's going to be used. Training happened in a 2-hour demo. Nobody's monitoring whether it's actually working, and there's no governance model for how decisions will be made when the configuration needs to change. This creates a gap between deployment and adoption, between the technical capability existing and the organization being able to actually operate it. That gap doesn't stay empty. It gets filled with shadow IT, workarounds, and technical debt. Users can't figure out how to use the system, so they use something else. They can't get access because the approval process is undefined, so they find a workaround. They can't maintain the system because there's no owner, so they let it degrade. They can't make decisions about how to adapt it because there's no governance model, so they just let it drift. The gap between readiness and deployment becomes invisible technical debt. Here's the research on this. 82% of IT leaders describe managing Microsoft 365 as a severe operational burden. That statistic isn't surprising if you understand organizational readiness. They're trying to operate a capability the organization was never ready for. The burden isn't because the technology is complex. The burden is because the organization is trying to maintain something without clear ownership, without documented processes, without dedicated monitoring, without a governance model. This is why technical excellence without governance creates the worst Microsoft 365 tenants. A brilliant architect can deploy the most sophisticated capability. The configuration can be perfect. The system can be elegantly designed. But if the organization isn't ready to own it, to maintain it, to govern it, then that beautiful technical system becomes an operational burden. Governance architecture includes organizational readiness as a prerequisite for capability deployment. You don't deploy until the organization is ready. You don't deploy until you have someone assigned to own it. You don't deploy until you have documented processes. You don't deploy until you have a governance model. You deploy when the organization has the capacity to sustain the capability. That's a completely different deployment model than most organizations use. But it's the only model that prevents the failures we've discussed. It's the only model where technical excellence actually translates into organizational value instead of organizational burden. Identifying governance debt in your tenant. If you want to know whether your Microsoft tenant will survive the next 5 years, start with this assessment. Governance debt is different from technical debt. Technical debt is something you see, a broken feature, a performance issue, a security vulnerability. You can point to it, you can measure it. Governance debt is invisible until it manifests as a crisis. Governance debt accumulates silently. A team is created without a documented owner. That's fine, it's one team, but 6 months later the owner leaves the organization and nobody notices. The team is now orphaned. No one knows who should be maintaining it. No one knows what data lives there. No one knows if external users still have access. That's governance debt. It's not visible. The team still exists. It's still taking up storage, but it's no longer being governed. Multiply that across hundreds of teams, thousands of SharePoint sites, millions of files. Governance debt becomes invisible technical debt that's slowly consuming organizational resources and creating risk. Here are the key categories of governance debt to look for. Identity debt is the most dangerous. How many global admins do you have? Microsoft recommends fewer than 5. If you have 20, you have identity debt. How many guest accounts exist in your organization? Are you actively managing them, or are they accumulating from partnerships that ended years ago? That's identity debt. How many app registrations do you have? Do you know what permissions they have? Do you know if they're still being used? That's identity debt. Collaboration debt is pervasive. Do all your teams have documented owners? If you have 500 teams and only 80% have documented owners, that's 100 teams with unclear ownership. That's governance debt. Do you have inactive teams that should be archived? A team that hasn't had a message in a year still consumes storage. It still shows up in search results. It's still a place where external access might be lingering. That's debt. Do you have SharePoint sites that nobody can explain? Sites that were created for a project that ended years ago but never got archived? That's debt. Do you have clear policies about external sharing, or have external sharing restrictions drifted so far from the original policy that you don't even recognize the configuration anymore? That's debt. Automation debt accumulates fast. How many Power Automate flows exist in your organization? Can you list them? Do you know who owns each one? Do you know what data they access? Do you know the dependencies between flows? If you have 500 flows and nobody can explain them, you have massive automation debt. Data debt is often the most consequential. What percentage of your files have sensitivity labels? If most of your sensitive data is unlabeled, you have data debt. Do you have retention policies applied, or are files living indefinitely because nobody defined how long they should be kept? That's debt. Do you have uncontrolled external sharing? Links that say anyone with this link can access it? Shared folders that have been forwarded to third parties? That's data debt. Here's what the research tells us. 45% of large organizations experienced a security or compliance incident caused by misconfiguration in the past 12 months. That's not a technical incident. That's governance debt manifesting as a crisis. Someone deployed Copilot and it exposed oversharing. Someone was compromised and had excessive permissions. Someone tried to do an access review and discovered they had no idea what permissions actually existed. That's governance debt that became operationally visible. The earlier you identify governance debt, the easier it is to address. Governance debt discovered in a pilot program is fixable. Governance debt discovered during a breach investigation is catastrophic. Most organizations don't measure governance debt until it becomes a crisis. They're operating in darkness, hoping nothing breaks, until something does. This is where the non-technical perspective becomes essential. You don't need to be a technical expert to identify governance debt. You need to ask simple questions. Who owns this? Is there a process? Is someone monitoring it? Can someone explain how it works? If you can't answer those questions, you have governance debt. That's your baseline assessment. Honest answers to those questions tell you whether your tenant is managed or whether it's quietly accumulating debt that will eventually become a crisis. The tenant durability checklist. Here's a practical tool you can use immediately to assess your governance architecture. This isn't a compliance checklist. This isn't something you're doing to pass an audit. This is a durability assessment. It tells you whether your tenant will survive the next 5 years. Start with identity. How many global admins do you have? Microsoft recommends fewer than 5. If you can't answer that question with certainty, you have a problem. If the answer is more than 10, you have a serious problem. Do you have a privileged access management strategy? If the answer is what's that, then you don't, and you need one. How many unmanaged guest accounts exist in your environment? The number should be declining, not growing. If you have guest accounts from partnerships that ended 3 years ago still sitting in your directory, that's identity debt you need to address. Move to collaboration. Do all your teams have documented owners? The answer should be 100%, not 95%, not most of them, all of them. If you have teams without clear ownership, you have orphaned spaces. Do you have lifecycle policies for inactive teams? You should. Teams that haven't had activity in 90 days should trigger a review. They should either be renewed or archived. What percentage of your SharePoint sites are orphaned? The answer should be 0. If you have orphaned sites, you're carrying dead weight. You're storing data you're not actively managing. You're potentially exposing information you've forgotten about. Look at automation. Does every Power Automate flow have documented ownership? Again, the answer should be 100%. If you have flows floating around with no clear owner, you have automation debt. Do you monitor flow failures and performance? You should know when a flow fails. You should know if performance is degrading. If you're running hundreds of flows and you have no visibility into whether they're actually working, you've lost control of your automation platform. Assess your data. What percentage of files have sensitivity labels? The number should be increasing over time. If it's declining or if it's stuck at a low percentage, you haven't built a data governance practice. Do you have external sharing policies? Not do you allow external sharing? Do you have clear documented policies about how external sharing works? When is it allowed? What can be shared? With whom? If you can't articulate your external sharing policy clearly, your external sharing is out of control. Look at AI readiness. Have you assessed permission sprawl in your environment? You don't need to have fixed it, but you should at least know what you're dealing with. Do you have a data classification strategy? Before you deploy AI at scale, you need to know what data is sensitive and what data is not. If you don't have a classification strategy, you're not ready for Copilot. You're not ready for agents. You're not ready for AI-driven analytics. You need that foundation first. This checklist isn't about compliance, and you're not doing this to satisfy an auditor or pass a security assessment. You're doing this because every question on this list determines whether your organization can sustain its Microsoft 365 environment. If you can answer every question clearly with the should-be answer, your governance architecture is solid. You have durability. You have clarity about ownership. You have lifecycle management. You have monitoring. You have policies that are actually being followed. You have a foundation that can sustain the platform as it evolves. If you can't answer most of these questions clearly, or if your answers don't match the should-be standard, then your governance architecture is weak. That doesn't mean your technical setup is broken. It means you're carrying governance debt. You're operating in a system where clarity is missing, where ownership is ambiguous, where monitoring is happening by accident instead of by design, where policies are drifting from reality. That's the difference between a managed tenant and an unmanaged one. Not whether the technology works, whether the organization can actually operate it. Moving from configuration to intent. Let me walk you through how to make the shift from configuration thinking to intent-based governance. This is where the abstraction becomes practical. Most organizations never do this shift. They follow their current approach and call it governance. But there's a 5-step framework that changes everything about how you design sustainable architecture. Step 1 is deceptively simple. Identify the intent behind each major governance area, not the configuration, the intent. What are we actually trying to achieve? Instead of starting with we enforce MFA, ask what behavior do we want to enforce around authentication? That's different. MFA is an implementation detail. It's a control. But the behavior you're trying to enforce might be users are authenticated based on risk, not just identity. Or critical accounts require stronger authentication than standard accounts. Or systems should adapt authentication requirements based on context. Those are intents. MFA supports those intents. But MFA isn't the intent itself. This distinction matters because intents are durable. Controls are temporary. Step 2 is designing principles that express intent without prescribing implementation. A principle is a statement that guides decisions without dictating exactly how you implement it. For authentication, a principle might be, we authenticate users based on risk, not just identity. That's a principle, it's not a specific configuration. It acknowledges that we're not treating all authentication requests the same. A user logging in from their home computer on the corporate network at 9 a.m. gets one level of scrutiny. A user logging in from a VPN from a new device at 3 a.m. gets different scrutiny. Same principle, different implementation. Another principle, we balance security friction with operational usability. That one acknowledges the tension. You're not maximizing security at the expense of work. You're finding the balance. What that balance is depends on the user, the application, the risk. The principle guides the decision. It doesn't prescribe it. Step 3 is defining configurations that support the principle. This is where you move from principle to implementation. What specific controls, policies, settings will help you achieve this principle? For we authenticate users based on risk, your configurations might include conditional access policies that increase authentication requirements for high-risk scenarios, MFA requirements for users accessing sensitive data, device compliance checks that verify the device meets security baselines, location-based access rules that adjust requirements for unfamiliar locations, usage analytics that identify anomalous behavior and trigger additional authentication. You're not saying we require MFA for everyone always. You're saying we require MFA contextually based on risk. The configuration is flexible, it adapts. Step 4 is building feedback loops that measure whether the principle is being achieved. You're not measuring whether the configuration is in place. You're measuring whether the actual behavior is what you intended. Are users authenticated appropriately? Are legitimate users able to work without excessive friction? Are attacks being blocked? Is the system still usable, or have you over-engineered it? Those are the questions you're answering. The answers tell you whether your principle is being achieved in practice. Step 5 is evolving the configuration based on feedback without changing the principle. This is where durability lives. A year into deployment, you discover that your conditional access policies are blocking legitimate business travel. Remote workers signing in from hotel networks are getting too much scrutiny. They're having trouble accessing files. The configuration isn't working, but the principle, authenticate based on risk, is still valid. You don't abandon the principle, you adjust the configuration. You refine the risk calculations. You add exceptions for legitimate remote work scenarios. You evolve the implementation while keeping the principle intact. Technical people often skip steps 1 and 2. They jump straight to step 3. They ask, what configurations should we deploy? Without understanding intent, without designing principles, and that's why they create technically perfect configurations that don't align with what the organization actually needs. Intent-based governance is harder to design initially. It requires thinking about principles before controls, but it's easier to maintain because when you know the intent, you can adapt the implementation as reality changes. That's the shift. That's how you move from configuration thinking to governance thinking. The role of continuous governance. This is perhaps the most important point I'm going to make in this entire conversation. Governance is not a project, it's a continuous practice. Most organizations approach governance like they approach an office renovation. They hire consultants, the consultants interview people, they design a system, they document it meticulously, they create policies, they create workflows, they create role definitions, they hand it off, and then leadership declares governance complete. We have policies, we have documentation, governance is solved. Now we can move on to the next initiative. But that's not how governance works. Governance is never solved. It's continuously maintained. You don't build a governance model and declare victory. You build a governance model and then you spend the next 5 years adapting it as the organization evolves and as circumstances change. Here's what the data shows. Most Copilot rollouts stall between week 6 and 12. Why? Because governance is treated as an event rather than a process. Organizations go through their governance checklist. They create policies, they configure DLP, they set up sensitivity labels, they declare governance ready, then they roll out Copilot. Week 1 is exciting, week 2 people are using it, week 6 something breaks. Maybe it's a compliance issue, maybe it's an oversharing problem, maybe it's a performance issue. By week 12, the rollout has stalled while the organization tries to fix the underlying problem. That stall happens because governance was treated as a gate, something you pass through before deployment, not as something you maintain continuously throughout the deployment. Continuous governance is fundamentally different from configuration management. Configuration management asks a technical question. Are the settings correct? Is the DLP policy configured correctly? Is the conditional access policy configured correctly? Is the sensitivity label applied correctly? Those are yes or no questions. The settings either match the desired state or they don't. Continuous governance asks a different question. It's not about settings, it's about outcomes. Is the system still achieving its intent? Not is the policy configured. Is the policy actually working? Are users able to work while still being protected? Are we catching oversharing before it becomes a problem? Are we identifying risks before they materialize? Is the organization adapting faster than the configuration is drifting? That's the difference. Configuration management is reactive. You deploy a policy. You monitor whether the configuration drifts. You fix it if it does. Continuous governance is proactive. You monitor whether the system is still achieving its intent. You adapt the configuration before it becomes a problem. You evolve the governance model as the organization evolves. Organizations that treat governance as continuous see dramatically better outcomes. They catch drift earlier, they adapt faster, they maintain durability longer. Why? Because they have feedback loops. Someone is continuously asking, is this still working? Is this still aligned with our intent? Do we need to adapt? And they're equipped to answer those questions because governance isn't something that happened once. It's something that's actively maintained. The technical people who understand this shift are the ones who move from being engineers to being architects. They still have deep technical expertise, but they've added a layer of systems thinking. They're thinking about not just whether something works technically, but whether an organization can sustain it operationally. They're thinking about feedback loops. They're thinking about how to detect when something is drifting. They're thinking about how to adapt without abandoning the underlying principles. Here's what continuous governance looks like in practice. You deploy a governance policy. 3 months later, you review it. Did it work? Are there unintended consequences? Is it creating friction that's driving users toward workarounds? You make adjustments. 3 months later, you review again. The organization has changed. You've added new applications. You've added new user roles. You've added new data categories. Does the governance model still fit? Do the policies still make sense? You adapt them. A year in, you conduct a comprehensive review. Is the principle still valid? Is the configuration still achieving the intent? Or have circumstances changed so much that you need to rethink the entire framework? That's continuous governance. It's not a project with a completion date. It's an ongoing architectural practice. And it's the only practice that produces durable systems. The organizations that understand this, that governance is continuous, not a project, are the ones that build Microsoft 365 tenants that actually survive. Not because the technology is better, not because they're more technically sophisticated, but because they understand that architecture is a living discipline that requires constant attention and adaptation. Building a governance-first culture. Technical excellence alone will not solve these problems. You can have the smartest architects. You can have the most sophisticated policies. You can have perfect documentation. But if your organization doesn't value governance, none of it will survive contact with real work. Building a governance-first culture is the hardest part. It's harder than designing the architecture. It's harder than implementing the controls because it requires changing how your organization thinks about technical work. It requires changing what you reward. It requires changing what leadership cares about. A governance-first culture means governance is a leadership priority, not an IT checkbox. It means that when your CIO talks about strategy, governance is part of that conversation, not something to bolt on later, not something to handle in governance, and part of the core strategy. It means architects are valued for designing durable systems, not just capable ones. Right now, the technical culture rewards capability. How much can we automate? How many applications can we integrate? How sophisticated can we make the system? That's where the respect goes. A governance-first culture values durability equally. How will someone maintain this in 3 years? What happens when the architect leaves? Can the organization still operate this? Those questions get respect. Those answers get rewarded. It means technical people are rewarded for thinking about sustainability, not just innovation. Innovation is flashy. You deploy a new feature. You automate a process. You integrate a new application. That's visible, that's impressive. Sustainability is invisible. You design a system that's maintainable. You create governance that scales. You build processes that don't degrade over time. Nobody sees it, nobody applauds it. But a governance-first culture recognizes it, values it, rewards it. It means organizations measure governance health alongside technical health. Right now, most organizations measure technical metrics. Uptime, performance, feature adoption, those are valuable metrics. But governance health is unmeasured. How many orphan teams exist? How many flows don't have documented owners? How many global admins do you have? How much governance debt are you accumulating? Those metrics should be measured, reported, tracked over time. If you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. Here's what the research tells us. Organizations with mature governance frameworks experience 23% fewer incidents. That's not coincidental. That's the outcome of building a culture where governance matters, where durability is valued, where architects are empowered to slow down capability deployment when governance readiness is lacking. Building that culture requires specific things from leadership. The CIO needs to communicate that governance is strategic, not tactical. Not we need to comply with this regulation. Strategic. Governance is how we scale. It's how we reduce risk. It's how we maintain control as the organization grows. It's core to our strategy. Technical teams need to understand that durability is as important as capability. Not more important, as important. You're not sacrificing innovation for governance. You're making innovation sustainable. You're asking what's the capability we need and how do we build it so the organization can actually maintain it. Architects need to be empowered to slow down capability deployment when governance readiness is lacking. Right now, the pressure flows one direction. Deploy faster, get to market faster, innovate faster. But a governance-first culture empowers architects to say, not yet. The organization isn't ready. We need to build the governance foundation first. And that should be respected, not overruled. This requires changing incentive structures. If architects are measured on speed of deployment, they'll optimize for speed. If they're measured on durability of deployment, they'll optimize for durability. If technical excellence is rewarded and governance durability is ignored, technical excellence will win. If both are valued equally, both will happen. It requires changing conversations. When someone proposes a new capability, the conversation can't just be, is it technically possible? It has to include, Is the organization ready to operate it? Do we have governance readiness? Do we have clear ownership? Do we have monitoring in place? If not, what do we need to do first? That conversation is uncomfortable. It slows things down. It requires saying no sometimes, but it's the conversation that builds sustainable systems. This is the hardest part because it requires changing culture. And culture changes slowly. It requires leadership commitment. It requires consistent messaging. It requires new people to see the pattern and understand that durability matters. It requires architects to feel safe, prioritizing governance even when other pressures push towards speed. But organizations that make that shift, that build a governance-first culture, are the ones that actually scale Microsoft 365 sustainably. They're not the fastest, but they're the ones still operating successfully 5 years later. The architect's responsibility. As architects, we have a responsibility that goes beyond technical excellence, and this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. When you design a Microsoft 365 architecture, you're not designing an abstract system. You're designing something that thousands of people will live inside for years. You're making decisions that will be felt by them every day, whether they can find what they need, whether they can collaborate effectively, whether they can work safely, whether they can move fast, or whether they're constantly hitting friction. You're creating the conditions for either sustainable collaboration or operational chaos. Most technical people don't think about it that way. They think about the system, the configuration, the elegance of the design, the optimization. Those are important, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is whether actual human beings can actually operate the system. This responsibility requires thinking beyond technical capability. It requires understanding organizational behavior. It requires understanding human psychology. It requires understanding what happens when a policy conflicts with how people actually work. It requires understanding that people will find workarounds, that they'll bend rules, that they'll circumvent controls if those controls make it impossible to do their job. You can't design sustainable systems without understanding those realities. The best architects I've worked with are not the most technical people I've known. They're not the ones who can write the most sophisticated code or design the most elegant infrastructure. They're the most thoughtful people. They ask questions that technical people often skip. They ask, who will operate this? Can they actually do it? Will they be able to maintain it when circumstances change? What happens when this assumption turns out to be wrong? Those are uncomfortable questions. They slow things down. They require admitting that your elegant technical solution might not be operationally viable. But those are the questions that separate systems that survive from systems that silently collapse. They design for the organization that exists, not the organization they wish existed. This is the critical distinction. A lot of architects design for a fictional version of the organization. They assume perfect execution. They assume clear processes. They assume that everyone will follow the policies exactly as documented. They assume that change will be managed carefully and thoughtfully. But that's not the organization you're designing for. You're designing for an organization with budget constraints, with competing priorities, with people who are overworked and overwhelmed, with processes that are more bureaucratic than strategic, with change that happens by accident as much as by plan. An architect who designs for that reality builds systems that actually work. An architect who designs for the fictional organization builds systems that immediately start to fail. They build governance into architecture from the beginning, not as an afterthought. This is where the shift happens. Most technical architects think about technical architecture first. How do I design this system? How do I make it scalable? How do I make it performant? How do I make it reliable? Then at the end, they think about governance. Okay, now how do we manage this? How do we control it? Governance becomes a layer on top, separate from the technical design. But governance-first architects think about it together from the beginning. How do I design the system so that the organization can actually govern it? What does governance look like? Who owns it? How do we prevent drift? Those questions shape the architecture, not the other way around. They measure success by durability, not just capability. A capability-focused architect measures success by features. How many processes did we automate? How many applications did we integrate? How sophisticated did we make the system? A durability-focused architect measures success differently. Can the organization still operate this in 3 years? Can someone who didn't build it understand how it works? Can it adapt when circumstances change? Can it survive without the original architect? Those are the measures that matter. This is the shift from technical leadership to architectural leadership. Technical leadership is about mastering the platform, learning all the features, understanding how to configure everything optimally. Architectural leadership is about understanding systems, understanding organizations, understanding the tension between technical purity and operational reality, understanding that the goal isn't to build the most sophisticated system. The goal is to build a system that the organization can actually sustain. That's the responsibility. That's what we're accountable for. Not just whether the system works technically, whether the organization can operate it, whether it survives, whether it creates value. That's the architect's responsibility. Practical steps to implement governance architecture. If you want to start implementing governance architecture immediately, here are the practical steps. Not theoretical, not aspirational. Concrete actions you can take this week that will begin shifting your organization toward durable governance. Step 1 is audit your current state. Use the tenant durability checklist we discussed earlier. Walk through every category, be honest about what you find. This isn't for an auditor. This is for you. You're establishing a baseline so you know where you actually are before you start moving. Most organizations skip this step because it's uncomfortable. You don't want to admit that you have global admin sprawl. You don't want to acknowledge that you have hundreds of flows with no documented owners. You don't want to measure the governance debt, but you have to. You can't move from where you're not toward where you want to be. You have to start from the truth about where you are. Step 2 is define intent for each governance area. Don't start with implementation. Start with intent. What are you actually trying to achieve? For identity, ask, how do we balance access and security? That's different from how do we enforce MFA? That's asking what behavior you're trying to enable. For collaboration, ask, how do we enable teamwork while protecting data? Not how do we restrict external sharing? What's the balance you're trying to achieve? For automation, ask, how do we empower innovation while maintaining control? Not how do we lock down power automate? What's the outcome you're trying to create? These 3 questions reshape your entire governance conversations. Step 3 is design governance zones. This is the framework that simplifies everything. You have 3 zones. Zone 1 is personal work. OneDrive, personal teams, chats, stuff that belongs to individuals. Minimal governance. You don't need to control this aggressively. Zone 2 is collaborative work. Teams channels, project SharePoint sites, places where teams work together. Moderate governance, clear ownership, life cycle policies, guest management. Zone 3 is enterprise records, HR systems, financial data, regulated content, strict governance, retention policies, sensitivity labels, access reviews. This 3-zone model instantly makes governance decisions clearer. You're not asking, how do we apply governance to all Microsoft 365? That's unanswerable. You're asking, how do we govern this specific zone? That's answerable. Apply different governance models to each zone. You don't need the same level of control everywhere. Step 4 is identify quick wins. Where can you improve governance with minimal disruption? Start with identity. Reduce your global admin count. If you have 20 global admins and the recommendation is fewer than 5, start working toward that number. Not by removing people's access suddenly, by implementing privileged access management, by delegating specific roles, by creating a plan to get to a reasonable number. This is a quick win because it's high impact and relatively straightforward. Other quick wins. Implement Teams lifecycle policies for inactive teams. Clean up guest accounts from partnerships that ended years ago. These are wins you can achieve without restructuring your entire governance model. Step 5 is build continuous monitoring. This is where most organizations fail. They implement governance and then stop. Nothing changes. Policies drift. Ownership becomes unclear again. Don't let that happen. Establish regular reviews of governance health, quarterly reviews of major governance areas. Are our policies still working? Is drift happening? Do we need to adapt? Create feedback loops that inform policy evolution. Automation debt discovered in month 1 should inform your automation governance by month 3. Permission sprawl identified in a review should trigger updates to your sharing policy. Step 6 is communicate the shift. This is the most important step because culture change is the hardest part. Help your organization understand that governance enables innovation, not just restricts it. Right now, people think governance is limiting. It's bureaucracy. It's saying no. Shift that conversation. Governance is the foundation that lets you move fast, safely. Governance is what allows you to scale without losing control. That's a different conversation. That's what gets adoption. Communicate what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the outcome will be. Do that continuously. Culture change doesn't happen from a memo. It happens from consistent messaging, from showing results, from demonstrating that governance makes work better, not just safer. That's the implementation path. Start small, start honest, move incrementally, build momentum, create the conditions for sustainable architecture. That's how you go from governance debt to governance durability. The long view, why this matters now. Let me finish with the strategic context for why this matters right now. Not in 5 years, right now, in 2026. Microsoft 365 is becoming more complex, not less. Every quarter, new capabilities are added. AI is being integrated into every application. Copilot is becoming the default way people work, not an add-on. The platform is expanding. The surface area is growing. The number of decision points is multiplying. If governance is difficult now, it's about to become exponentially more difficult. The organizations that haven't built governance architecture are running out of time. At the same time, AI capabilities are surfacing governance debt instantly. Copilot can access any data available to users across SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and Exchange. That means Copilot can surface overshared data, it can expose broken permissions, it can make visible what was previously hidden by obscurity. 73% of organizations in regulated industries have paused Copilot rollouts due to data exposure concerns. Not because Copilot is unsafe, because their own data governance is unsafe, because they have years of permission sprawl that they've never fixed. Copilot didn't create that problem, it revealed it. The regulatory environment is tightening simultaneously. The EU AI Act is now in effect. Organizations operating in Europe face legally enforceable obligations around AI governance. not best practices, legal requirements. They must demonstrate control over AI systems. They must maintain audit trails. They must ensure fairness and transparency. Those are not optional suggestions. Those are compliance requirements. Organizations that deploy Copilot without governance are deploying a regulated system without compliance controls. That's not a technical problem. That's a legal problem. Licensing costs are increasing. Microsoft has announced significant pricing increases effective July 2026. Organizations are facing double-digit percentage increases on their Microsoft 365 licenses. That budget pressure forces a conversation. What are we actually getting value from? Where is licensing waste? Where is governance debt creating unnecessary cost? Organizations that haven't measured governance debt suddenly need to justify continued investment in capabilities they're not actually operating effectively. Here's the inflection point. Organizations with strong governance architecture are moving forward confidently. They're deploying Copilot, they're implementing agents, they're scaling AI capabilities, they understand their data landscape, they have clarity about permissions, they have lifecycle management, they can deploy safely, they can scale sustainably, they can take advantage of new capabilities without creating new risk. Organizations without governance are stalling. Pilots are pausing, rollouts are halting. Why? Because when you try to deploy Copilot at scale and you discover you don't have governance readiness, you have to choose. Slow down the deployment and fix governance, or deploy anyway and accept the risk. Most organizations are choosing to slow down, and that slowdown is expensive. The license costs are accumulating. The capability isn't delivering value. The organization is standing still while competitors move forward. The technical people who understand governance architecture are about to become the most valuable leaders in enterprise technology. They're the ones who can deploy AI safely and sustainably. They're the ones who can navigate the regulatory landscape. They're the ones who can extract value from the platform without creating chaos. They're the ones who understand that technical excellence is not enough, that durability matters, that governance is architecture, not compliance. Organizations are going to be scrambling to find architects who understand this. Architects who can balance innovation with sustainability. Architects who can build systems that actually survive. The technical people who don't understand governance are about to become increasingly frustrated. They'll build brilliant systems, elegant configurations, sophisticated automation, and then they'll watch those systems become unmaintainable. They'll watch organizations struggle to operate what they designed. They'll watch Copilot deployments stall because governance wasn't ready. They'll watch automation platforms collapse under complexity. They'll be frustrated because they did their job, they built great systems, but the organization couldn't sustain them. This is the moment. The next 18 months are going to determine which organizations scale AI sustainably and which ones get stuck. Which organizations deploy Copilot confidently and which ones pause in panic. Which organizations extract value from their Microsoft investment and which ones accumulate licensing debt. The difference won't be technical capability. Microsoft will handle that. The difference will be governance maturity. Organizations that build governance architecture now will have the foundation. Organizations that wait will be playing catch-up. And catch-up is expensive. It's disruptive. It's painful. You're better off doing the work now. The confession completes. I'm still not the most technical person in the room. I don't write production code. I don't tune infrastructure. But I've learned something that the brilliant technical people in the room don't always understand. Technical excellence without governance creates the worst Microsoft 365 tenants. The engineers and the failures we discussed were talented. Really talented. The problem wasn't their expertise. The problem was that brilliance applied to the wrong problem creates systems that are technically perfect and operationally impossible. The goal of architecture is not to build systems that work today. It's to design systems that organizations can still operate 5 years from now. That requires thinking beyond technical capability. That requires understanding governance, understanding organizational behavior, understanding that people will find workarounds if your architecture makes their job impossible, understanding that durability matters more than perfection. If you're building Microsoft 365 architecture, start with governance intent, not configuration. Design for the organization that exists, not the one you wish existed. Measure success by durability, not just capability. And remember, the most dangerous architecture is the one that works perfectly on day 1 and collapses silently in year 3. Subscribe to the M365 FM podcast for more insights on Microsoft 365, governance, architecture, and the human systems that make technology sustainable. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always looking for the next story of technical excellence that created governance failure, because those stories are how we learn to build better systems.